In this segment, I'm going to introduce you to what is called the Synoptic Problem. First point we have to make is that although we have one Jesus that the entire church responds to and speaks about, we have four different accounts of his life. And they are known as the four Gospels. The word gospel comes from a Greek word that means good news. So there are four Gospels. There are four different accounts of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And although in some basic structural features they are similar and they are clearly talking about the same person, they do differ in many significant items. And what I want to talk about in this segment is what are the categories of these differences, how we may account for them, and what might be the significance of these differences. First of all, when we look at the four Gospels, we notice immediately that three of them are very, very closely related. And one of them is significantly different than the other three. So the first category of division we make is between the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the last Gospel, John, which is totally different. The first three Gospels we call the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic, too, comes from two Greek words, sun, which means with, and obviously optic, eye. And what that means in an expanded definition, synoptic means the Gospels that see the life of Jesus in fundamentally the same way. So they're seeing Jesus' life from the same point of view when contrasted with the Gospel of John, which sees things from a totally different point of view. So now I've introduced you to the word synoptic and the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What then is the synoptic problem? The synoptic problem is the question that's raised when we ask ourselves, how do we account for the differences between the various synoptic Gospels? They are not exactly alike. They have some significant differences even among themselves, even though they're regarded as having fundamentally the same point of view. So how do we account for these differences? First, what are the differences? Or perhaps a better way to ask this question is, what is the relationship between the three synoptic Gospels? And the first thing we notice when we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Mark is much shorter than either Matthew or Luke. And so we notice, first of all, the brevity of Mark's Gospel. We notice also something very interesting. Almost all of the content that's found in the Gospel of Mark is also found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. That is, if we could imagine the Gospel of Mark as being a kind of circle, that circle is contained completely in the larger circles of Matthew and Luke. How do we account for this fact that Mark is contained almost entire in the other two Gospels? There are two theories that have emerged from that. The first one is saying that the Gospel of Mark is a kind of digest or condensation of one of the longer Gospels. They usually say Matthew. And in fact, this was the popular position for many, many centuries within the Christian tradition, that Matthew was the first Gospel, which is why it appears first in the New Testament, and Mark is a kind of digest or condensation or abbreviation of the longer Gospel of Matthew. This particular position is not widely held anymore, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think the strongest one is that there's a kind of suddenness and immediacy and roughness to Mark's Gospel. And it really doesn't make sense that somebody would take a very smooth and sophisticated and well-structured literary document such as the Gospel of Matthew and kind of roughen it up and weaken the grammar and take away some of the flowery description. It's really hard to kind of psychologically justify a movement like that. So the more common idea, and the idea that I myself believe, is that the Gospel of Mark was written first, and that both the writers of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke had the Gospel of Mark available to them and used the Gospel of Mark in the preparation of their Gospel. That would explain, when you look at the repeated lines right next to each other, you notice that it just seems that Matthew and Luke expand and elaborate and add flourishes and even in some ways soften the blow of some of the harsher statements that we see in the Gospel of Mark. So we've answered the first part of the synoptic question, which is, what is the relationship of Mark to the other two synoptics? And my conclusion, at least, is that Mark was written first, Matthew and Luke were written afterwards and had the Gospel of Mark available to them. The next part of the synoptic question is, what about the material, and there's a lot of it that's found in both Matthew and Luke that is not found in the Gospel of Mark. And we see two different categories of information that we would regard as present in Matthew and or Luke, not present in Mark. The first category is there is a large block of material that is present in both Matthew and Luke, but is not present in Mark. And that material, scholars have actually gone through and compared verse by verse and pulled out the material that's found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And they put it together, and they really believe that at some point in distant church history, there was a single coherent document that was floating around in addition to the Gospel of Mark, which these two gospel writers used. So now we're saying that the writers Matthew and Luke, they had available to them the earlier written documents of the Gospel of Mark and this other document. Now we have to have a name for this other document, even though it doesn't exist, even though nobody has ever found it. And scholars call that document Q. And the reason they call it Q is because there's a German word, and most of the New Testament scholars who formulated this theory were German, and there's a German word, Quelle, and Quelle means source, Q-U-E-L-L-E. And so this Q document was thought to have circulated in the early first century church. What's in the Q document? Well, you could actually figure that out, but it's the stuff that Matthew and Luke have in common that's not found in Mark. And we find that there's only a certain kind of material that's like that. And it's all sayings, extended and single-line teachings of Jesus, and to distinguish it from behavior of Jesus, things that Jesus did. So the Gospel of Mark, if you look at it, has very little teaching from Jesus. It's mostly stuff that he did. And then the stuff that seems to be added to Matthew and Luke are things that Jesus taught. So it's believed that the Q document is actually a collection of Jesus' teachings, which Matthew and Luke each used in their own way. There's another category of material that's found in both in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark, and that's material that is exclusive to one or the other gospel. In other words, there's certain material that's found only in Matthew and not in any of the other synoptics. Like, for instance, the birth in the stable and the Magi coming, and I think the shepherds, I believe, are in Luke. There's material that's in Luke that's not found in any of the other synoptic gospels. So it appears, if I can just kind of reconstruct this for you, that the gospel writers had available to them the earlier written works of Mark and Q, which they both used to formulate their gospel, and each of them also had material available to them that was not available to anyone else. For instance, there's quite a lot of stuff about Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke. And one of the interesting theories is that Luke actually had available to her Mary and close companions of Mary to interview and talk about. But anyway, we could leave that for a moment and get on to the final part of this question, which is, how do we account for these differences? Why is there not just one story of Jesus? And I think we could account for these differences in a number of different ways. The Gospels were written first at different times. Second, they were written in different places. Third, and this is most important for our purposes, they were written to address different concerns. For instance, the Gospel of Mark is believed to have been written in Rome, very much influenced by the presence of the Apostle Peter, and it's writing to a church that's being persecuted by the Romans. And if you read it with that lens, you notice that there's all sorts of stuff in the Gospel of Mark about suffering persecution and being righteous and suffering persecution. Matthew and Luke were written from different places and probably had very different theological concerns. Luke wrote a lot about the poor, for instance, and he was very concerned about that. Matthew wrote a lot about the relationship of the church to Judaism. And they seem to have different theological concerns. And finally, as these Gospels were written and circulated, they each had certain geographic regions that were loyal to that particular Gospel. And so finally, fairly late in early church history, like maybe 150 or 200, the four Gospels became the common possession of the church, and they were all put together, the three synoptics and the final one, John. What does this tell us? I think it tells us a few important things. For one thing, all through Christian history, they've tried to boil the Gospels down into a single story, and they've never been able to in a way that has caught on or been in any way adequate to communicate Jesus. So clearly, what the early church wanted to communicate about Jesus, and I might add what the Holy Spirit wanted to communicate about Jesus, could not be contained in a single, coherent, univocal, one-voiced story. It had to be in these four different dimensions. The life, the story of Jesus has that level of fluidity and ambiguity within the early church, and that continues to us today. And so the various Christian communities, they read the four Gospels, and they resonate with certain depictions of Jesus, and others fall out of favor and fashion and then come back in. There's a fluidity to this that comes from having four Gospels instead of one.